Welcome to part 2 of my 9-stage financial fitness plan. So with no more ado, let's get straight in there. If you missed part 1, not too difficult to find, there's a clue in the name hopefully. So why are we worrying about financial fitness at any age, but in particular as we hit our 50s and 60s, where the amount of time we've got left to earn money may be starting to run out. So why worry? We've all got to take more responsibility for our financial welfare. In part 1, I explained that the baby boomer generation never had it so good. Subsequent generations do not have some of the benefits that they enjoyed. So we've got to take more responsibility. It's not a choice, it's a necessity these days. You can't rely on the state, you can't rely on your family, you can't rely on your kids, you can't rely on anyone, frankly. And that's why we've put together a 9-step guide to financial fitness. Now, in part 1, I dealt with all of this lot: personal balance sheets, setting long-term goals, budgeting, emergency funds, and dealing with debt. So I'm going to consider that done. Please have a look at part 1 if you've missed it. In part 2, the remaining steps in the 9-step plan: review your investment portfolio. You may not have done that for a while, it's important. Save tax effectively, a couple of no-brainer ideas almost there. Sort out your records. In other words, think about other people, actually. Make sure you're set up for the worst case scenario, and help your children. And I've put that as step 9, and people might be thinking that's a bit harsh. Help your children, step 9. Yeah, because I see people who try and help their kids and then end up relying on their kids because they haven't got it right. You need to sort yourself out first, get yourself organised so that you're not a burden on your kids, because your kids could be living anywhere and they might not thank you for making yourself a burden later. So that's step 9. So let's go for it. These are very much a summary of the key stages. This is just a short video. For my booklet, I'll give you an email address at the end. That will expand on all of these points for you. Review your portfolio. Now, your portfolio of stocks and shares. The key questions to ask are, both when you set it up and as you review it, and you should be reviewing it, I would say, a minimum of annually actually. What we're trying to do here is say, does my current asset allocation, that's a grand way of saying the amount I've got in shares, the amount I've got in bonds, and the types of shares and bonds, for example, and funds, does that reflect my current risk appetite? And that changes over time. When you're young, you've got to be taking risks, because if you don't take it then, when are you going to take it? Yeah. So the asset allocation for someone who's 25 could look very different to someone who's 5 years away from retirement and doesn't want to take too much risk. Maybe they did earlier in their life, but now they don't, and that's quite sensible. So is my current risk appetite being reflected? And my drawdown requirements. What you don't want to do with a portfolio of shares is to be forced to sell them at just the wrong time, because shares are volatile, markets go down as well as up, so you need to think about when you're going to make those big drawdowns. So 2 quite important issues, and I've made them sound very simple here, but they require a bit of thought actually. Now, just to make my point, here is the FTSE All-Share going right back to the early 70s, and the wobbliness of that line tells you all you need to know. Now, there have been some big, that's the last 49 years or something, there have been some big dips along the way. The biggest, this one doesn't look big because of the way the graph's constructed, but anyone who bought there and heaven forbid sold there would have lost around 2/3 of the value of their shares. So that was a big one. Then we've got another big one there, another big one there, and lots of bobbles along the way. So focus on the big ones. Those big downturns, downswings have lasted around 5 to 7 years. So in terms of dealing with that issue of don't be a forced seller, be careful that you're not kind of forced to liquidate shares at the wrong time to meet a cash drawdown, for example. Here's an approach that takes account of the past. Now, the past is no guide to the future. It's always the caveat we have to give, but if that holds, that pattern, then a sensible approach would be get your rainy day fund from part 1 sorted. Get your 3 to 6 months salary parked in something cash or near to cash for an emergency. Then identify future calls on capital and when they'll crystallise. Not to the absolute day. There may be, maybe you can identify a range of dates, but you should know when those university fees fall due, when you want to pay for that car, when you want that big round world trip, when you've got to pay that mortgage deposit. You should have some idea. For timeframes of up to 7 years, you want to be mainly in cash with a bit of flexibility. In other words, if you know you've got to pull cash out of the stock market in 2 years, you don't want to be in the stock market. You don't want to be running your portfolio right up to the last minute, hoping you liquidate when it's on an uptick. Beyond 7 years, funds, yeah, fine. It looks like historically you would be safe committing those funds to the stock market, where historically the best real returns are to be earned compared to IOUs like gilts and cash. Monitor your portfolio regularly, at least once a year. See where you're at, check your risk appetite, check those drawdowns and position accordingly between, to put it simply, cash, stuff a bit like cash, IOUs, corporate and government bonds, and equities. I'm assuming in all this you've also prioritised your main home, and that's perfectly sensible because of the tax breaks on it. Now, saving tax efficiently. I'd cover this in a lot more detail in other videos. What are ISAs? How SIPs help pension savers? ISAs versus SIPs. So this is just a quick summary. It does make sense to shelter as much as you can in a tax shelter. Why? Because otherwise you're just giving money away in effect. Now you can shelter quite a lot of money in these two tax shelters. ISAs, individual savings accounts, just to give you a flavour of how much can go in here. $15,240 per adult in a standard ISA. Married couples get that twice. Okay, and $4,080 per child per year in a junior ISA. So there's quite a lot of scope here to put money sort of away from the tax man and protect it from further income and capital gains tax. And there's no limit on the size of the total lifetime ISA allowance. In other words, once you set up an ISA, it can get as big as you like. You can be an ISA millionaire, for all I know. The government won't suddenly impose a kind of an emergency tax on it. And you've got flexibility about when you pull it out. Self-invested personal pensions, on the other hand, a bit less flexible, but you can put quite a bit in there. 100% of net relevant earnings capped at 40, in some circumstances 10, but I won't cover all those circumstances right here. And there's a lifetime allowance. You have to be a little bit careful once the pot, if you like, of the money you've paid in gets to a certain amount. You've got to be a little bit careful that you don't go above the limit, because then a kind of an emergency rate of tax kicks in. So a little less flexibility on the right-hand side, but some useful tax breaks on both sides. And what I mean by that is, here's a summary of the tax position. This is the main reason people look at these products. With ISAs, there's no tax relief on the way in. So if you're earning a salary, that's been taxed already. Pop the money into an ISA, but there's no further income tax or capital gains tax to pay on it. With a SIP, you do get tax relief on the way in. So a basic rate taxpayer can pay 80p in. The government chips in another 20 in effect to bring it up to £1 invested. And on the way out, minimum age at the moment is 55, that's rising, a tax-free lump sum, so there's tax relief on the way in, tax relief on the way out for some of it, first 25%, and the remainder is taxed at your marginal income tax rate. So without going into the details, a useful way to potentially save tax over the long term, and the longer you leave these to work, the better they are. For example, the power of an ISA, then we'll move on. If you were to make a $1,250 monthly investment, where would you be after 15 years? If we assume, and these are assumed rates, a 3% growth rate, a 6% growth rate, or a 9% growth rate. None of these are guaranteed, they're purely illustrative, but there is the amount you've put in, $225,000, that's 1,250 over 15 years. That's the same in all three cases. Here's the tax-free growth on top, the icing on the cake, a little bit at 3%, quite a decent wedge at 6%, and quite a lot at 9%, adding up to 283,500, 360,000, and 462. So were you to get, no one's guaranteeing it, 6% growth over the period that you're making the investment, 225,000 becomes more like 360 for not that much work, really, if you think about it. Okay, more about that in other videos. Sorting out your records, just a couple I'll mention here. We should all have a will and a power of attorney in place, or most of us should, certainly with dependents. Wills sort out a whole lot of stuff you do not want to leave behind. Who will look after your estate on death? Who will be the legal guardian of your children? All of the stuff you need to sort out, and there's no automatic rules about this, and how your assets be distributed. All important stuff. A power of attorney is something people often forget to set up until it's too late, until they can't because they don't have the mental capacity to do so. There are a couple of types, but who's going to manage your financial and or medical affairs and make key decisions were the worst thing to happen. No one wants to think about these things happening, but important to plan for them. And while you're at it, make a list of key documents and where they're held, like your title deeds, for example. And finally, help your children. Now, I'm not going to go through all the basics here because I cover that in another video with a similar title, but Make sure they understand the purpose of money early, teach them how to budget, and I cover budgets in the previous part 1 of this series, and help them to start saving as early as possible. And one way you can do that, one way you can encourage them, is through something like a junior ISA. If £4,080, that's the limit at the moment, was invested once when a child is just 2 years old, and you might as well take some risk, get it into equities, earning a real return of 5% per year, not guaranteed, but historically that kind of rate is possible. What would it be worth when they turn 30? 4,080 goes in, and that can come from anyone potentially, not just parents, not even just grandparents. And age 30, for doing nothing, that becomes just under £16,000. And that means the purchasing power of the amount invested has gone up by around 4 times. Okay, a recap then. A 9-part plan for getting your financial fitness improved and getting financially fitter. Part 1 dealt with in the previous video. Take a look at that if you haven't seen it. Part 2 is the remaining 4 steps. A lot of ground covered. If you'd like more detail on that in written form, please do email me and we'll post out a copy of my free guide as soon as possible.